Alrighty, so we've finished Galatians. We're moving on to our little rapid fire slingshot through Jude to finish out the year. We have, off memory, 7 scheduled Bible studies, including today, which will fit nicely into one of the shorter books of the Bible in general, but including the New Testament. All of the grand total of 25 verses. Not as short as 2nd John and 3rd John, which are, I think, 13 and 14 verses respectively. Not as short as, or about the same length, I think, as places like Philemon in the New Testament as well. But nevertheless, the one single chapter, as we usually call it, the 25 verses, of Jude. But it's short length. We should not think erroneously it to be something that is pithy or trivial. It's actually quite a theologically dense book, to be totally frank, even in such short content. The substance of it is primarily dealing with false teachers, with the contentious issue of the faith. We'll talk more about that later. But today's lesson is really mainly, like we've done for each of the studies, is background. Okay, so we'll technically cover verses 1 and 2, or at least certainly verse 1. But it's really mainly giving background, like we did with the book of Acts, which I think we did over 2 lessons almost, and then the same as we did for our previous study, which was the book of Galatians, of course, giving the contextual background, outline, helping us understand what on earth this text actually is, who it's written by, who it's written to, all that jazz. So not as long a lesson today, but giving us some of the background of the book, and it'll help us as we go through it. Before we commence that, let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Alrighty, so usually a good place to start when you come to a new book of the Bible is with the eponymous name to whom it's ascribed. Of course, in this case, Jude. Jude himself, if you have a look at verse 1, kind of identifies himself in passing, obviously. Jude, a slave of Jesus Christ, or your translation might say a servant, same thing, the Greek word doulos. A slave or a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Okay, again, your translation might say Jacob. Does yours say James? James? Yeah, okay, cool. That's what it should say in English. Before we get on to James, because that will be part about who we're talking about, Jude, James is but the English version of the name Jacob. Okay, so that's where the name James comes from. So anyone named James is ultimately named after the patriarch Jacob, as in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who was renamed Israel. James, Jacob, same name. It's one of those cases where sometimes it's a matter of a name being brought from Hebrew into Greek. Sometimes it's the custom that was common in the days of the Roman Empire, where people, citizens and non-citizens, would have 2 names. They would have dual names, essentially. They would have a native name and then a Hellenized name, in other words, a Greek name. There's various different kinds of ways that this occurs. Even his own name, Jude, is technically falling in that somewhat similar category. The name Jude coming from Judah. Okay? So a very common name. That's why there's multiple forms of how we find this name. You're probably much more familiar with the other more common transliteration of this name, which would be Judas. So with Judas, right? Which itself is the Greek version of Judah. Okay? So Judos, meaning Judah. So Jude, Judah, Judas, all the same name, which can be interesting because, of course, there's many Judases that we find throughout the scriptures. Obviously, of course, most infamously Judas Iscariot, right? Judas the betrayer. There is obviously this Jude, or this Judas, who's otherwise known elsewhere in the Gospels as Thaddeus. So this is Judas Thaddeus, we sometimes call him just for simplicity's sake. One of the apostles. There's Other things we find from other historical texts, Judas was a very common name throughout, much like Jesus was in many respects, as a common name of the day. And so when it comes to who these people are, sometimes we actually have to get specific in these texts. Obviously, this is not Judas Iscariot, for obvious reasons. But here he identifies himself as the brother of James. And so that gives us insight, obviously, to say James the Apostle. Who himself... Yes, that one. Yes, that one. Because, yes, there are also multiple Jameses as well. We usually distinguish them by calling them James the Greater and James the Lesser. That's a designation of age, not necessarily of esteem or renown. Greater and lesser usually came to mean size or age, kind of like we have the island of Great Britain, as opposed to what the Romans called Ireland, which was Lesser Britain. Of course, we don't call it that these days because the Irish would probably have a revolt, being called Lesser Britain. But anyway, James the Greater, James the Younger, yes. But anyway, this is the brother of James, who himself is being identified as the one in the Gospels usually that comes across as James, the brother of the Lord, is usually the designation. Okay, he becomes the first leader of the Church of Jerusalem. So we see him most famously in Acts chapter 15. This is James I'm talking about here, sorry. We see him more or less presiding over the Council of Jerusalem in AD 50, which is in Acts chapter 15. Important leader in the Church of Jerusalem, basically its first bishop. Here this is Jude or Judas Thaddeus, all the same name. Okay, so if you see that throughout Scripture, that's who this is referring to. Okay, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the specifics necessarily of the designation brother of James or brother of the Lord, because we do actually have a question about that in the Q&A. Specifically about the nature of the brothers of the Lord and what does that term brother mean? Were they his biological brothers, or is there a broader designation? Because that is a debate or a discussion in recent Christian history. So without diving fully into that, there are competing views as to how that specifically works, what that word brother means in context here. I have my views, but long story short, it doesn't necessarily change the nature of who this is. The important part I'll save a lot of that for the Q&A session if you're interested. But long story short, Jude, or Judas Thaddeus, is one of the apostles. The fact that he calls himself the brother of James is actually really more of a statement of his own humility, to be honest. Because elsewhere the apostles do identify themselves as apostles, which is totally normal and fine. By calling himself the brother of James, which is a bit of an odd designation. Usually the way that you would ever identify yourself historically, including in this culture here, is as the son of someone, right? So we see that plenty of times, right? So that's why Jesus himself is often called the son of Joseph by others around him, for example, right? Especially up in Galilee, or in Nazareth even more specifically, as the son of Joseph. But by identifying himself as the brother of James, he's really mainly drawing connection from himself to James and James's connection to Jesus, right? So really, ultimately, that means his own connection to Jesus, because after all, he's brothers with James, right? His apostolicity, as we would say, his status as an apostle, he doesn't gloat over or kind of self-identify as. He would allow himself to be identified by the other apostles, just like Paul did when he returned from Arabia. But nevertheless, a servant of Jesus Christ, the brother of James. And so this, what do we know about Jude? Well, we know about Jude from a couple of other texts historically, primarily from Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the more prominent, really probably the most prominent early church historian, wrote the first real proper church history, which is actually called literary church history. That's his main work, ecclesiastical history or church history. And he cites a number of other secondary source texts from the 2nd century, specifically, and I could probably find it quickly enough, hopefully. Assuming I can remember the date that it was written, that would be helpful. Yeah, okay, I thought so. Good. Yes, it is in his work, in his History Ecclesiastica, or his church history, that he cites a number of texts from the 2nd century, various church fathers, that explain, those who basically were the second generation after the apostles, that explain some of the works of the apostles that we don't get in the book of Acts, because obviously it's limited to the first half focusing on Peter, second half focusing on Paul. But nevertheless, with Jude and along with Bartholomew, they often quite worked together. That's pretty clearly identified in some of the 2nd, 3rd generation texts that we get. Both he and Bartholomew, so that is Judas and Bartholomew, were the primary missionaries or apostles to the region that in ancient times was called Armenia. Okay, there's obviously a country today called Armenia in the Cork, or the West Asian region, right, north of Iran, east of Turkey, surrounded by countries like Azerbaijan, Georgia, parts of southern Russia, Dagestan, etc. In ancient times, however, a very large region of the northern Mesopotamian world where a lot of this is set, so parts of what today would be eastern Turkey, northern or northwestern Iran, obviously Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, quite a large region was called the Kingdom of Armenia. Okay, by the Romans it was called Armenia Major, or Armenia Major, Greater Armenia. It was a region much bigger than what the current nation state is today. The Armenians received the gospel from the apostles Judas and Bartholomew. Okay, both of whom were martyred there. Judas, off memory, in other words, Jude, right, was axed to death, essentially, was killed. Bartholomew had a much worse fate, probably the worst fate of any of the apostles. Bartholomew was flayed, in other words, skinned alive. That's how the apostles tended to die. Bartholomew certainly got the worst of it compared to others. He didn't have a nice, clean death as Paul would, which would be beheading, which is obviously instantaneous. He is a Roman citizen. Roman citizens could be put to death, but that was the only way that they could. So he was never in threat of being crucified, unlike some of the others like Peter and whatnot. But nevertheless, both of them were martyred in the greater region of Armenia. But their work was not in vain. The Armenians are really actually ultimately the first place to have to fully have on a national sense, have their people or their kingdom convert. I forget the name of the specific king that it was, but right around the year 301, the king of Armenia converts to Christianity and thereby converts the kingdom. So they're not the first people group on the whole. The very first people en masse to convert to Christianity were the Assyrians, so neighbours to the south. But at the national level, in terms of like politics and the kingdom itself, right, Armenia was the first kingdom to convert in that sense. So work that begun by Bartholomew, and in this case for us, more importantly, Jude, bore very good fruit. And the Armenians are still Christian to this day. About 98% of the country is still Christian. They face horrible persecution, have throughout history. The Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks after World War I, a genocide that very few people wish to acknowledge politically because of its political tensions with Turkey and Europe. I think about 1.5 million Armenians were killed or otherwise ethnically cleansed. About 1.5 million.
I met, he was a dentist in France, and I spent a bit of time with the family, and he was Armenian, which was about that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big thing for them, yeah, exactly. So about 100 years ago now, yeah, it was in the 1920s roughly, or through the end of the war really, and the kind of political turmoil and fallout of the Ottoman collapse and the beginning of the new Turkish Republic and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, they still face massive incursions from the Turks to the west and the Azerbaijanis to the east. unfortunately aided by the Americans because they're more geopolitically important against Iran. But yeah, they face serious problems. But anyway, long story short, the work of Jude is still there to this day. They've been Christian for 2,000 years and counting. And so yeah, God bless them. But this Jude, outside of that, not much is known specifically. And so in terms of the context, what we do get here, though, is something that's quite interesting. Like I said in the introduction, apart from its short nature, especially comparatively speaking to much lengthier works in the scriptures, very substantively dense. So it's not just going to be a gliding 6 weeks. It's I've chosen it for its brevity, but also because of its meatiness, so to speak. Essentially what's going on here, if you just, without doing a full exegesis on it, just to give you a concept, he explains the purpose for his writing really in verse 3. Beloved, whilst I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, exhorting that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. Okay, so that's verse 3. What he's saying there in short, and again we'll cover it when we get to that lesson, but in more detail, but he was already actually writing a letter to to whichever particular church community is that receives this. There's not a specific church that's identified, which is why it's called Jude, unlike where we have called Paul writing to the Galatians or to the Romans and whatnot. So that's more, it's titled after the recipients. This is one of those other apostolic epistles, like the letters of Peter or of John, which are named after the author, not the recipient, right? But he was already writing a letter to the original recipients. That's why he says, whilst I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, in other words, about the Christian faith, I felt it necessary to write to you exhorting that you would contend earnestly for the faith. So in other words, he was already writing a much larger work, presumably, that's basically what he's saying here, but then something has caught his attention that's been going on among them that's caused him to write this shorter, quicker letter dealing with this specific thing. Of course, interestingly and ironically, in God's providence, whether or not he did or didn't finish the work on that other letter, we have no idea. We don't have that letter. We have this letter. So this is clearly what... so for whatever reason, God has diverted his attention away from whatever the discourse of his other letter was to help them with this specific letter, which is obviously shorter. And so there was a problem, which of course is usually the case of how things are written. It's usually dealing with some problem or another, right? That's usually a good reason for writing a letter to someone, especially to a group of people. Obviously with Paul's letter to the Galatians we've been going through, that was the Judaizing heresy. When he writes to the Colossians to the west of Galatia, he's writing about dealing with the Gnostic heresy, right? Because they're not struggling with Judaizing heresy, but they are struggling with the early Gnostic cults, which are battering against them. Various other kinds of things, like with Romans, which is more of a general exhort, dealing with much bigger issues than just specifics. That's why it's written to the most important city in the world at the time, Rome, right? All these kinds of things. Jude here is doing just that. So the whole premise of the letter is that he's exhorting them to contend, in other words, to fight earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. Okay, somewhat akin to this concept of the ancient paths, which we looked at yesterday on All Saints Sunday, right, from Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16. That's the essence of this letter. And so how does he go about, what's the overall structure? Obviously the bulk, the kind of main discourse is from verses 3 to 19. Okay. And as we go through this letter, what you'll realize is that he's kind of just rapid fire throwing out various different references to things left, right, and center from either the Old Testament or as well as even some of what we call the Deuterocanonical works or the apocryphal works. Right? Specifically, a book called First Enoch and another one called the Testament of Moses. Okay, we'll talk more about that when we get up to that point. That's primarily where he draws from. He draws from stories or accounts that he also draws from other parts of the Old Testament. So, for example, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that gets referenced. So he's referencing both biblical elements and what we call extra-biblical texts, right? Sometimes what called the Judeo-canonical books or the apocryphal books, both really referring to the same thing ultimately. These are other additional works that existed during what's called the Hellenistic periods. In other words, once Alexander the Great had conquered the world, at least all the important parts of it, he then, obviously then the Greek age begins, what we call the Hellenistic period, where the culture of all these kinds of parts of the world, including even the Judeans, right, so those of Judah who returned from Babylon, lived under the Persian Empire. Alexander conquers the Persian Empire. Now they're under the Macedonian Empire and its successors, namely the Seleucid Empire. That's the Hellenistic period. So basically between Malachi and Matthew, which is where our Bible is ordered, right? Malachi is the last, at least literally, the last Old Testament prophet. Technically, John the Baptist is the last Old Testament prophet, or the Old Covenant prophet, but either way. In terms of the writings, Malachi is the last of them. And then, of course, we move into the New Testament from there. But that 400-year period, which lies between them, is what we call the intertestamental period, what the Jews called the 400 years of silence. Okay, it's intentionally mirroring the 400 years of silence that exists between Joseph, I'm rounding off here, but Joseph and the Exodus. Okay, so Moses, right? Where they're in Egypt for 400 years, 150 of that they were directly enslaved, obviously. But that 400-year period, there's no prophets, there's no anything until God redeems them from the house of slavery. And it's intentionally mirrored that God repeats that pattern again with another 400 years. There's no prophets at all. One of those intertestamental books called First Maccabees makes that apparent. That's from the 2nd century, BC that is. And in First Maccabees it explicitly states and explains that there were no prophets in the land in these days. Right? There were no prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and anyone else, right? There was no message from heaven, there was no word of God going on, right? In terms of actively live, right? And then all of a sudden, of course, comes Christ, who starts repeating many of the things that go on. And his first act, of course, is born and then goes into Egypt and then comes out of Egypt and then eventually goes through the River Jordan and is baptized through the waters, just like the people were baptized through the Red Sea, all these kinds of things. So it's mirroring that. That's why there's that 400 years of silence. But anyway, whole other subject. Point being that a number of common popular books or writings, right? Some short, some long, some multi-books, First Enoch, Second Enoch, etc. You have books that become, or letters that become kind of common popular literature, basically. And so people know and they grow up with the stories from those works. They weren't considered inspired scriptures. They weren't considered what we call canonical, right? In other words, meaning part of the canon of scripture. But they were certainly treated with great respect. They were read and learnt from as containing wisdom, right? Kind of like how we can read all kinds of works from, pick anyone you want, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Shakespeare, Chaucer, pick who you want, right? We can read plenty of works in the history of the English language, and the themes and the lessons and the moral wisdom, etc., that we can glean from that, right? That's basically how they were treated. And so he references, as in Jude, references a couple of different stories, as I said, from some of those apocryphal or Judeo-canonical books, right? Namely and specifically First Enoch and the Testament of Moses, okay? And so the stories that from those particular accounts you won't find in Scripture, but he's referencing things that the people know of and he's using them as examples. It's akin to how, and again we'll talk about this again as well when we get into those texts, but it's akin to how the Apostle Paul at different points, say for example in Acts chapter 17, when he is in Athens and he is addressing the Areopagos, basically Mars Hill, which kind of lies just to the west of the Acropolis in Athens, where the Parthenon is at the top. Right? It was the place where debates were held, philosophical discourse. The Supreme Court of Athens met there, etc. Right? It was a very important civic place. When he's giving his famous speech in Acts chapter 17, he quotes from a couple of different Greek or Hellenistic philosophers. Right? He quotes specifically from Epimenides of Crete, as well as another famous philosopher from Tarsus, which was his own town as well, from his hometown. And that's where we get that phrase, in him we live and move and have our very being, when he's referring to God. Right? Originally coming from the Greek philosophers, that was in reference to Zeus. Okay? He's taking that well-known phrase, or that well-known quote, from prior Greek or Hellenistic philosophical writings that people just know as sayings, right? And he's applying it to God or to Christ, right? So it's that kind of same thing. We do that all the time, obviously, with our own things. I did that yesterday, thinking about it, right? When I mentioned the phrase "lest we forget," and I referred to the recessional and whatnot in the sermon, right? Same thing. No one should come along in 2,000 years' time and then somehow find a transcript of a sermon that I did once and then think that I'm quoting Kipling's recessional as being a biblical text. Right? Quoting other parts of other texts does not inherently denote them as canonical or as biblical, because that is part of a debate, right? So some throughout Christian history would argue that his quotation here of First Enoch denotes it as canonical, right? Because Peter also quotes from First Enoch as well in his epistles, right? So the argument that gets made is that you have two apostolic quotations of this text from the Old Testament period that must give it weight or authority as being inspired like the rest. Seemingly logical, but doesn't quite work, because otherwise then Paul is quoting pagan philosophers whose texts we don't treat as being inspired by God either. Right? Anyway, point being is that he's using this structure and these various rapid-fire references to make a point about what the overarching issue of this short letter is, which is that there are false teachers who have come among the particular congregation or congregations, plural, diocese, whatever it is, that he's writing to. The actual audience that he's writing to are being overwhelmed by false teachers, and he actually makes a point at a certain point where basically he and Peter say almost the identical thing. So it's showing this is not just something in isolation. This is actually what they're doing, which we'll talk about more as well when we get there, is that they've clearly heard and listened to and learnt from Christ's own words, where he says that many false prophets shall arise, right? And of course we can apply that more abstractly to other periods of history. That certainly holds weight. The primary context is talking about the first century, for reasons that we'll get into when we go through that. But we can of course extrapolate from that in a more general sense that yes, we should always be wary of false teachers arising, right? And so he's using these kinds of examples in this particular structure between verses 3 to 19, and it subdivides basically down into verses 5 to 10, 11 to 13, 12 to 15, 16 to 18. Like he's using these kind of compact subsections in that broader 13 to 19. I'll provide, when we get into the substance of the text in the next lesson, I'll give you an actual physical outline so that you can have it. There's no maps or anything like we've had for previous lessons because it's not geographically based. But you'll then be able to have it that you can you can either read it or you can bring it every week, whatever you want to do. That will show you some of the specific outline that we can then follow along as we kind of go through here. But nevertheless, it's referring back to stories of rebellion, all kinds of things. Like I said, he refers back to the rebellion of Korah during the book of Numbers, which we've touched on briefly in Deuteronomy. He talks about the deception of Balaam the sorcerer from the book of Numbers, He talks about a whole host of things. I think I mentioned Korah. Oh, he talks about Cain, references Cain as well, references stories about fallen angels, references things like in the Testament of Moses about the Archangel Michael and Satan arguing over the body of Moses, which comes from that extra biblical book, etc., etc., etc. It's all these examples that everyone who read this letter originally would have immediately known of and gone, oh, okay, that's what he means, that's what he means, that's what he means, right? So context is super, super important. But all about the warning of the consequences of what happens when A, false teachers arise, and B, more importantly, people listen to them. Okay, that's basically what it's primarily about. And so, yeah, it gets quite substantively dense in terms of these rapid fire kind of stories. The consequences of it, particularly around the nature of these false teachers, and this is really the larger grand conclusion of the letter, which is that, as the saying goes from this ancient agrarian society, including as is referenced multiple times in the Bible, you shall know a tree by its fruits. Okay. He doesn't even really focus all that much, if at all, on the theology of the false teachers. Not that that's irrelevant, that's not what he's doing it for. He focuses on the way they live, because basically what they're doing, these false teachers, is they're what we call, in theological terms, antinomians, which just simply comes from the Greek word nomos, meaning law, right? Anti-law. Basically, they are taking the forgiveness and the grace of God as liberty or license to just basically live however they want, right? Because we're forgiven, and God is gracious, and so now we have a blank slate. Yeah, that's basically what they're doing. And so he's essentially pointing to all these examples throughout this letter of here's the consequences of false teaching, of heresy, blah, 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 and the impact it has on all these practical outcomes, right? Because the best way to demonstrate, or the best way to ascertain what someone truly believes, is to look at how they live. Ergo, you shall know a tree by its fruits. That's really the grand conclusion, or the grand premise, I should really say, of this letter. So, that's the structure. That's a bit about Jude, the man himself. Like I said, apostle, related to Jesus, described as part of the Adelphoi, the brothers of the Lord. I'll answer more about the nature of that when we do the Q&A if you're interested, as the different Christian views, and then how that work, what the views are historically, where I line up, etc. But nevertheless, 100% related to the Lord, no question. That's no one debates that. An apostle, again, much of his work was in that region of Greater Armenia, along with Bartholomew. Faithful, one of the lesser known of the apostles, but someone who writes a very powerful letter, which proves that even someone who really is not all that much in focus throughout the Gospels, right? So much of the Gospels is, of course, revolving, at least in terms of the disciples, as they called it at the time, around the kind of inner triumvirate, the three of Peter, James, and John. This is the other James now. Not James the brother of the Lord, but James the brother of John, right? Those three, who were the three eldest, Peter being the eldest, were kind of that's why we call them a triumvirate, the three kind of inner core, who we see interacting with Jesus the most. Jude is there. Jude features every now and then, right? But then it comes along to one of his works, which was not even a primary work. That's what he's indicating in verse 3 that we looked at, right? Whilst I was writing to you already about the Christian faith, right, presumably a longer work than just 24 verses, he then decides to pause that and write a short, quick letter that deals with this problem. And that's the one that ends up becoming inspired by God and canonical, which is fascinating. Proof, if anything, that we can plan all kinds of things as people, but then God is the one who directs our steps. And God's plans often can manifest and come to fruition in ways that we may not have otherwise foreseen. and this kind of letter is a good example of that. So yeah, it'll be good. It'll be a good one to work through. Like I said, 25 verses, which seems short. The core of it, obviously, is verses 3 to 19, at least in bulk, certainly, and then finishes off from there. But a very important lesson. Will obviously, when we get to some of these ones these kinds of examples, these drawing from the Deuterocanonical books or the apocryphal books, same thing. I'll use those terms interchangeably throughout. We'll actually read some of that and get some of the context. What on earth is the story? What's it mentioning? More importantly, why is he using it? What's the actual reason why he's drawing from these well-known, common folk stories, quote unquote? Because that'll help us bridge the gap. We're trying to bridge a 2,000-year gap where when we hear these stories, they're not things that are told and known every day, or we didn't learn them as children, which is totally normal. They did 2,000 years ago in their culture. So when they hear these stories, they don't need to go, oh, what's he talking? They know, oh, okay, yeah, I can see it. And he's drawing connections like that, right? So we can bridge those gaps pretty well. So that'll be cool, cool to do. So yeah, that's that. There we go. I'll have the specific outline for next week the next lesson, which is where we will start diving into the actual text itself, right? So there we go. Yeah, short and sweet. Just the outline. Do you have any? Obviously, we haven't covered much yet to have warrant for all that much question. But do you have any questions or anything? Anything you want clarified? Yeah. Cool. Good. All right. Sweet as. Good. There's no harm, obviously, in reading it. It'd take you all of about 5 minutes to do. No harm in going through and reading it, and then that can hopefully then give you some of give you at least an idea of what the literal substance of it is. Read it a couple of times, maybe at least once or twice, maybe between here and next lesson. And then as we go through, we'll kind of just chop it down into small little subsections, especially when it's starting to get to some of those apocryphal or Deuterocanonical references where we can then go and I'll not the entire work obviously, but I'll print out the broader section of where it's coming from in First Enoch or the Testament of Moses, these other interesting books from the centuries prior, from the Hellenistic period, and we can have a read of that and see what the story is and why this is happening, and that'll give us some of the context, and we can. So sometimes the lessons will just be mainly focused around that kind of thing. Sorry?
Are they in the library or anything?
No, we wouldn't have any of those here. We wouldn't have any of them here, but certain versions of, obviously, some of the certain editions of the King James Version would have the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical book still included, which First Enoch would be there. That's a much longer work, though, much more complex, quite an esoteric book. But no, we don't have any copies here. And so what I'll do is I'll probably just print them out. I'll print out the section that it comes from, and then we'll have a copy, and then we can all sit there in that study and read through it. Yeah. So, good. Very good.